Thank you very much, Gary. Good evening from Israel. I hope everyone can hear me well. I'm going to talk, as Gary said, a little bit about what's the burning issue in Israel at the moment, the thing that's leading the news, the thing that's really leading the conversations on the streets, and in fact is plugging up the streets, if you will, day after day, sometimes week after week, certainly. And really, it's the major issue which is being discussed here in Israel, and I understand in the diaspora and in foreign ministries and in governments and leaderships around the world. First of all, I want to start on a very positive note, and hopefully we'll end on a positive note, but let's wait and see where this goes. You know, the state of Israel, most of us, many of us, have never lived in a time where there wasn't simply a state of Israel. We've taken it for granted that it is a liberal democracy. We like to say it is the only liberal democracy in the Middle East. And in fact, it leads in many ways many other older, more established democracies around the world. But it's certainly not a given. First of all, because as I said, you know, Israel did create something unprecedented on the soil of the Middle East or the Near East. For the first time in history, a democracy, a liberal democracy was created. And if we look at where it all began, it certainly wasn't a given. The state of Israel welcomed, even before the state and certainly after, Jews from over 100 nations around the world, speaking dozens of languages. But what united almost all of them is the fact that they all came to create, to establish a democracy when the overwhelming majority of them had no experience of democracy. If we think about who formulated the state, it was people who escaped the Nazi concentration camps. It's people who escaped the gulags, the Stalinist purges, the mellahs of the Arab world and beyond. Apart from a few like Golda Meir, who lived in America, and a few other obviously very famous examples, the absolute overwhelming majority of those who founded Israel as a democracy and really established its governance, etc., just had simply no active experience of democracy. And here we are, fast forward to the 21st century, and Israel is really a leading light in democracy. It is a member of the OECD. It is, according to rankings I saw the other day, the 4th happiest place on earth, which is quite nice. And it really is, you know, in every single arena and area, Israel is just really fulfilling its potential and moving forward at a really stellar pace. You know, we know about it as a high-tech superpower. We know it as about security superpower. We know it is about, you know, a nation which really does catch the eye for good and for bad, mostly for good, I would say, although the bad always takes more of our attention. But it really, it was not a given. And the fact that there were many, many threats to Israel's democracy before the state, after the state. And I wouldn't say today there is the greatest threat to democracy, but there certainly is on the table something that will certainly shape Israel's democracy moving forward. It's a debate whether, certainly there are people who are opponents of this judicial reform who would say it is a great threat to democracy. But I'd like to sort of give you a little bit of information about the background, maybe a little bit about both sides. I'm going to try and retain a semblance of neutrality here. I have worked with both sides of the aisle. I do have good friends in the Knesset on both sides of this debate. I was in last week and I heard from at least 3 voices from the coalition and 3 voices from the opposition. So, you know, I hear what's being said behind closed doors. I do hear what really are the grievances that are sometimes just not heard. But again, I'd like to sort of go back a little bit in history. It's not the first time that the right and the left obviously have butted heads in Israel, as they do in many other political systems around the world. During the early years, it was very much sort of a Ben Gurion-led camp against Menachem Begin of the First Revisionist Party and subsequent Cherut and Likud. And that obviously changed in 1977. There were major, major issues. But what was most important is that neither side got to a point where civil war was really on the cards. There were many very brave decisions. I would say by both sides, again, if we're looking pre-state and post-state, that really averted it because there was an understanding that what we were doing here in Israel, the Zionist enterprise, the Zionist project, the state of Israel, whatever you want to call it, was something unique and unprecedented. And really, we didn't have much wiggle room to give our enemies any chance of, sort of conquering us. And we needed social cohesion. And I think that's what our leaders, whether on the left or on the right, really understood. And, we can go back to the Arlosor assassination, the Altalena, we can go back to all sorts of events, which in many other societies could well have led to civil war. But in 1977 was probably, one of the most major events in Israel's history, and where you can really see the foundation of what we're seeing today. For the first time in Israel's history, the left lost the elections, the right won the elections. Menachem Begin won the election. I'm not going to get into the whole history or sociology about why he won, the fact that, the Mizrahim, as they're called, the Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, basically moved across and from the Labour alignment to the Likud party, and that really upset the apple cart, as it were, because those who felt that they had formed and formulated the state were now on the outside, were in the opposition, and it was called a ma'apacha, a revolution. And it didn't go down well with those sort of left-wing secular elites, and it was considered by many that the riffraff had taken control of the country and it was doomsday, and this was going to be the end of it. No country would ever meet with Menachem Begin. He was a known terrorist. These are the voices that were being heard. But again, fast forward, and we understand that many of these predictions did not come true. Menachem Begin ran a steady ship, then Yitzhak Shamir, and then there was the unity government with Shimon Peres. But for the most part, since 1977 until today, with some obvious gaps, the right wing has led Israeli society, I should say Israeli politics, and the trends are moving to, in 2023, to an even greater a gap. Again, you can drill down to the numbers and look how, if you really look at all the parties that didn't make it through the threshold, the numbers are not radically different. But if you look at the birth rates of those who are represented in the current government, and you look at other trends, then probably the trend is more towards the coalition parties. Well, sorry? I heard someone talk to me now. Okay, sorry. But what was felt on the right over the years and is really swelled to a point today, and what has led to this concept of judicial reform, is that the right believes that it wins the elections, but it still does not rule. It still believes the left rules. And that is a concept based in, again, I'm giving the argument to the right here, or the current members of the coalition, if you will, that while the right wing will win the majority in parliament, in the Knesset, it will form the government, the powers behind the scenes, or sometimes in front, are still very much from the left-wing Ashkenazi elite, secular elite. And those include the media, they include the NGOs, they include various other sectors of Israeli society, but most importantly, they are represented in the Supreme Court. And ever since the Aaron Barak revolution, who really epitomized that sort of elitist worldview, again, I'm giving the arguments on the right, basically created an infrastructure that was not mandated in law, that gave a Supreme Court power to sit above the Knesset, in fact, even above the government, to basically allow itself to rule on any decision it deems fit. There is a very maximalist interpretation of standing here in Israel, whereas the Supreme Court in America will see, a few dozen cases every year. The Israeli Supreme Court sees many, many times that, because it's decided that any individual in the state of Israel has standing to bring a case against the government or the Knesset or a particular law, whereas in other places like the US, I'm not 100% sure about the UK system, even though I'm originally from the UK. In the US, you have to be directly, or you have to prove you're directly impacted by by a particular statute. In Israel, you do not have to. And there are many NGOs that look at everything, that petition the court and have a ruling on, as I said, laws and statutes and even government decisions. I remember a number of years ago, there was a decision by Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman, and defense ministers have the power to decide which Palestinians from Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, or Gaza can come into Israel. And there was an event. I just want to use this as an example. This example is actually used by proponents of judicial reform as an example of judicial overreach. And on Yom HaZikaron, Israel's Remembrance Day, there was going to be an event that included not just members of Israel's fallen, but also members of Palestinian fallen. And there were accusations that some had connections with terrorist organizations, and they were killed doing various acts, et cetera, et cetera. Avigdor Lieberman denied the requests of, I think it was like a dozen Palestinians to attend this event on Yom HaZikaron. His point was, you can have this event any other time and I will sign off on their entry, but it is problematic on Yom HaZikaron because it offends the sensibilities of many other people. This was then overruled by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that no, it disagreed. It didn't give any particular legal standing to it. It just disagreed ideologically with the defense minister, who was the elected representative, and it overruled, and these people were let in. So the executive and the legislative branch can be overruled again and again. And it is felt on the right that even though they are the democratically elected representatives, there is still a power that has decided and placed itself above it and can overrule it at every turn. And many times it has done. I'll give you the most prominent example, which many people give, and I think this is very important for those who follow Israel. Without understanding what happened in 2005, it's very difficult to understand what's happening in 2023. And what do I mean by that? 2005, for those who remember, was the year of the Gaza disengagement. And the Gaza disengagement was obviously something which was, for the right wing, considered very, very problematic. Let's not forget, as opposed to these elections where it was, it was open that what the policies were of this government. At that time, Ariel Sharon, who was the leader of the Likud party, said, Din Netzarim, Din Tel Aviv. What he meant by that is the law of Gush Katif, which were the Israeli communities within Gaza, is considered exactly the same, in my mind, to Tel Aviv. And that's what he went to the ballot box. And many people voted, and he won the elections and formed a pretty stable government. Relatively soon after, we can debate why and the reasons for it. He did a bit of an about turn and decided he was going to disengage completely from the Gaza Strip. There were a lot of problematic elements of it. Again, from the right wing, I would say there was a lot of problematic elements legally, but also as much as the opposition to disengagement were allowed to demonstrate. There was a lot more of a heavy-handed nature to the demonstrations. There were buses that were not allowed to leave the place that they left from. People were arrested. Certain interrogation methods were used against protesters. All sorts of people were not allowed to leave their homes. And in the end, as we know, disengagement went through. Again, did it go through all the necessary legal channels and challenges? The right would say absolutely not. The law was trodden on, civil liberties were trodden on, the right to demonstrate, the right to freedom of speech was trodden on. Yet the Supreme Court and those supporters of it did nothing. It wasn't about civil liberties, it was about ideology. And that is what the right wing led many of the most prominent proponents of judicial reform to where they are today, chiefly Simcha Rotman, who is the head of the Knesset Judicial Constitutional Legal Committee, and Justice Minister Yariv Levin, and various other. Today, we are at a very, very tense period because what is happening with this judicial reform, many opponents would say it is it goes too far. There are many people in the current opposition, the former government under Lapid and Bennett, who were proponents of judicial reform. Gideon Saar wrote a whole treatise on judicial reform and even tried to move things forward. Avigdor Lieberman, who's sitting in the opposition, has spoken many times about the need for judicial reform. Yair Lapid has also talked about judicial reform. So the idea of some level of reform is not anathema to the majority of the elected representatives on the opposition. What has happened is after the elections, this whole judicial reform, rightly or wrongly, has been branded as authoritarian, has been anti-democratic, has been a majoritarian tyranny, to use some of the buzzwords, and it will upset the balance of powers far. If at the moment, the balance of powers, the proponents would argue, is far more tilted towards the unelected judicial bench, this will basically make the Supreme Court almost toothless. Again, the laws haven't passed, and I even just saw, just as I came on, that Bezalel Smotrich, who is the head of Simcha Rothman's party and very much a proponent of judicial reform, has actually called for the brakes a little bit and said, let's have more time to discuss. I didn't really see the details involved in that, but it's clear that even the strongest proponents understand, well, I wouldn't say even the strongest, the strongest proponents want this through at the maximalist level. But what is happening now is that there are, the whole show, I would, for want of a better word, is being run by the maximalists on both sides. In the Knesset and in the government, it is run by those who want the harshest and strongest judicial reform to make the Supreme Court almost irrelevant and to give the executive and the legislature almost complete primacy in every way. But the people who are running the demonstrations on the streets are not prepared, it seems, to even talk, to even enter into a discussion of judicial reform. And that has led to a strengthening of the position or hardening of the position of the opponents to judicial reform, the current opposition, who are not prepared to discuss. I mean, there are different elements. Benny Gantz's position is not the same as Yair Lapid's position, and Mirav Michaeli's is not the same as Avigdor Lieberman, but there has been no alternative put on the table, no serious alternative. There was, about a week ago, 2 Likud members who were very much on the out with Netanyahu, who came up with a proposal with 2 members of Benny Gantz's party, but it didn't go anywhere. There was also, as we know, President Herzog proposal, but again, it was felt by the proponents of judicial reform that it basically left the current situation, as it is, and ensured that the judicial system remains supreme and above the Knesset, and that certainly did not meet even the, I would argue, the smallest demands of the right. The question is also that should be asked at this point, and I'm happy to answer questions in a few minutes, is what is behind it, and what do the different sides want? Well, Yariv Levin, the most important thing for him, and I've even heard it said that if he gets this, he's happy to drop most of the other elements. He wants the ability of the government and the coalition to be able to have a majority to appoint future Supreme Court justices. At the moment, the majority on the committee to appoint Supreme Court justices is the justice system itself, is the Supreme Court justices, the Law Society, et cetera, et cetera. So they can keep electing those that think, look, and act like them. And that is where the right wing have a problem, because again, it's just a sort of self-fulfilling bench, which basically just has the same outlook, the same background again and again, with obviously some minor exceptions. So for him, it's very important that once the will of the people has been heard, the coalition is put together, that it then has the responsibility or possibility of having a majority to be able to then bring in Supreme Court justices more in line with its thinking. The override clause, which is arguably the most controversial, which allows the Knesset to override a Supreme Court decision. What that means is the Knesset can try and pass a law. The Supreme Court could say, no, that's unconstitutional, and strike it down. Then a basic majority of 61 would then be able to override, which means that Supreme Court would be almost irrelevant. And that's a simple majority. There have been a lot of people who have said, if you're going to have major decisions like basic laws, which are Israel's quasi-constitution, then there should be at least some crossbench activity, some multi-party consensus on this, move the numbers up to 70 or 80. As we know, the current coalition is 64. But that the group or the parties which are most obstinate on this are the ultra-Orthodox parties. Probably in some ways more than the right wing, the ultra-Orthodox have felt that many things which are important to them, whether they should go to the army, whether they should receive stipends equal to people in the army, or preferences in job seeking, etc., and issues on religion and state, the control of the rabbinate just came up now, whether hospitals, this is a hotly debated issue, whether hospitals should allow chametz, leavened products to come in during Pesach. That is something the ultra-Orthodox are very, very strongly supporters of, but it got struck down in the past by the Supreme Court. So the ultra-Orthodox, even though they're not the ones publicly leading it, are very, very strong on this, to the point where they've said that any override clause more than 61 is a non-starter for us and could cause a coalition crisis. They are very, very much leading that particular element. Where does Netanyahu comes in? Netanyahu has his own legal problems. It's clear from historically that many of the problems with the legal system, at least from his point of view, did begin perhaps around the time where he started to have legal problems. Another proponent who's sitting in the background is Aryeh Deri, who also has his own legal problems and is currently not allowed to sit in the government because of a Supreme Court decision. So he wants that overridden. But I would say that Deri and Netanyahu are probably the more to the moderate side of judicial reform. The question is whether the whole issue is out of Netanyahu's hands. Today, a couple of days ago, there was talk that if judicial reform would be moderated in any way, Yair Levin would quit. And Yair Levin is an enormously powerful and enormously popular figure. And Netanyahu doesn't want to be seen as coming down on this. But the problem that we will have in Israel, and we're seeing demonstrations every week, we're seeing Israeli officers not turn up for Miluim, for their annual national service. We're seeing people, high-tech companies threaten to take their billions out of the country. We've heard international credit rating agencies say that Israel could lose its AA+, I think it is, rating. We've heard a lot of doom and gloom, doomsday stories of what can happen if judicial reform comes through. Netanyahu is hearing this. He is certainly worried by this, but he also understands that he has very little wiggle room. There is not much pushback within the Likud party. There are few voices on the side, but really no one of significance has come out against. Yuli Edelstein dipped his toes in the water at one point. Nir Barkat, the former mayor of Jerusalem, today came out and said, and this is really what could be the biggest sort of moment in the near future. What would happen if the Israeli parliament, which is doing currently, passes a law on judicial reform that the Supreme Court then annuls? And if the parliament or the government decides to override that, decides, okay, that decision no longer counts, because that is what we're doing here. We're legislating to make your decision null and void. Then we enter a constitutional crisis. No one is quite sure what's going to happen. Yair Levin, the justice minister, has come out and said, well, we have to ignore the Supreme Court. Nir Barkat, a popular figure, but not necessarily an overly powerful figure in Likud, has said, well, we have to accept the Supreme Court's decision. If it strikes down any of these laws, then we just have to accept it, which is a bit bizarre from a party which is pushing, as I said, to if not ignore, certainly weaken the power. And if they are able then to stop this whole process, then it's all for naught. So it's a bit of a strange position, but it's certainly one that Israel will have to deal with in the near future if we continue hurtling towards what is judicial reform. Because at one point, the army, the police, the national authorities have to decide, who do we side with? Do we side with the Supreme Court, or do we decide with the legislature and the government? If the government make a decision and the Supreme Court says no, but the Knesset said, well, your decisions are no longer binding, we are in a constitutional crisis. And that is not something that any Israeli would like to see. So I think most Israelis, you may not hear their voices, because that's the moderate sort of silent minority or majority, I would say, are hoping that really we can come to some sort of compromise. At the moment, it's looking very distant, because the extremes are running away with it on both sides, and they are very much in control of the agenda. But it is hope that we will be able to, take a moment, really find the golden mean between the both sides to deal with those problems that clearly we have in our judicial system, but not remove that checks and balance to the point where we just have a government and a legislature, which when it finds itself in the majority can basically decide on anything without any pushback legally, constitutionally, or politically. That's what every Israeli really hopes for, I believe, or most hope for, but we're certainly not there. We are hurtling towards this very problematic situation, this potentially constitutional crisis, which would affect, and it already is starting to affect, Israel's security, Israel's economy, Israel's society. And certainly we can't afford, if as I said when we started, Israel cannot afford these problems, these cracks in our society. I believe, I promise to end on a positive note, despite what I'm hearing, I do believe that Israeli society has learned enough from its past, is aware of the challenges that it faced, whether it's Iran, whether it's the Palestinian terrorism, whether it's economic issues, whether it's its relations with the outside world, generally tends to understand that we need to come back from the brink, and we need to do this together in a cohesive manner and with unity. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on anything I've mentioned during my opening.
Thank you very much, Ashley. If you want to ask a question, please can you raise your virtual hand? And if you don't know how to do that, you go to the bottom of the screen and there's a circle there with the word reactions. You click on that and it says there, raise hand. So if you'd like to ask a question, could you do that? The first questions I've got Mervyn Smith, then Dania Hajjot, then Ruth Hart. Mervyn. Can you unmute yourself? Oh, good. If you can unmute yourself, that's it. Great.
Fine. I'm horrified at the situation in Israel. And it strikes me that it's a disaster, because the basis of democracy in Israel is based on the democracy of the United Kingdom, which is where it started. And I've never believed that, with all of the respect to Haredi, that they should never be involved in politics. They have their own politics. And when, in my opinion anyway, they move out of that aspect, it becomes a disaster. And that, to me, is the scenario that presently exists. And I think that Netanyahu has lost his mind a wee bit to become involved in permitting the Haredi to try to become politicians outside their environment. And I don't know how that will be overcome. And perhaps you can throw some light on how that could be overcome, because it's like the Pope taking part in high politics in Italy.
Thanks, Mervyn. Ashley.
Okay, I'd like to actually even connect your 2 points. First of all, Israel did take quite a lot from the British political system, but it also took from other places, and legally as well, Ottoman law, Jordanian law. But most importantly, our system of proportional representation was actually taken from the Weimar Republic. And I would argue that really that was its blessing, and today it's its curse. What I mean by that is Israel has a very extreme version of proportional representation, which, you know, even though it was raised a couple of years ago, the minimum party can be 4 seats, and you can even, at the moment, we have a party of 1 seat, but that's because it ran together. Basically, you can hold a government to ransom, if you want to use that word, on the basis of 2 seats, 3 seats. In the last government, we saw how long it held on with a majority of 1. I mean, there was all sorts of shenanigans, if I can use that word, that was going on to try and, you know, take that down to 60 and basically make the government fall. There was not a moment that all sorts of things were tried to make sure that that government would fall. Israel has never, ever had a situation with a one-party rule. It's always been a coalition, which means that smaller parties usually hold the balance of power, which means they have quite a lot of power. Now, the system was very important at the beginning of the state because it gave representation to so many different sectors of Israeli society, Arabs and ultra-Orthodox and modern Orthodox and left and right and communist and Mizrahim and this and that and the other. And it was very important really to try and bind the state together because there were so many warring or opposing communities. But if you had representation in the Knesset, you felt at least part of the political system, and it made a lot of sense at the beginning. Unfortunately, if we look, you know, we fast forward to 2023, and I wrote about this, I think 10, 12 years ago, that it will lead us to political paralysis. And we are there. We've been there for 3 years. So what does it mean that when a prime minister gets put into position, they don't know that when they will have to face another election. They know that they will not see out their term. No Israeli government in its history has ever seen out a term. There was the Golden Meir during a war, but no government has ever seen it out. And every prime minister knows that that the clock starts ticking the moment that they're sworn in. What does that mean? That all they are doing, not all, but majority of the time they're putting up fires in the coalition. They're not necessarily doing what's good for the state. They are throwing money at problems. They're throwing power. They're throwing, a party with only 4 seats can basically decide we want this, this, and this, even if the vast majority of the rest of society want something different. The ultra-Orthodox understood that very early on, and they understood that they had a role to play. And if you look during Netanyahu's career, I was in 2 governments when I was officially as an internal advisor. One of them was with the ultra-Orthodox parties, and it lasted 4 years. I think it was the second longest Knesset in the history of the state. That was with the ultra-Orthodox. There was another government that I was in without the ultra-Orthodox. It lasted, I believe, 13 or 14 months, and there was not a day without a crisis. What did that teach someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, who wants to be in power, who wants to remain in power? That what you need is stability. You need parties that are not going to give you a hard time. The ultra-Orthodox have understood the usage of power in that way for stability. So any prime minister, it doesn't matter if it's Netanyahu, Gantz would be the same way, arguably Lapid would be the same way, Tzipi Livni in the past, many others. They all need the ultra-Orthodox because on the whole, if you give them what they want, stipends for yeshivot, you give them what they want in religion and state, these are not major international diplomatic incidents. They're not things that drive voters to the polls. They're not things that drive voters to the streets. But if you give them that, you will get a certain amount of stability. And that is the name of the game. And that is where the power of the ultra-Orthodox lies. And there is no possible way in a democracy, in any politics, where you can decide a party shouldn't exist, especially, by the way, if it has that power. If you're saying in the past, that's one thing, but today no party is going to pass a law to make it no longer exist. So there's never going to be a rule, not in the foreseeable future. And again, demographically, the ultra-Orthodox community is just increasing, which is going to basically ban themselves. They're not going to vote for a party to ban a law that would ban their own potential to run. So the ultra-Orthodox are very much in the center of Israeli politics to stay, and they will continue growing because, as I said, most politicians will sit with them, most politicians will give what they want, because stability is the name of the game, because of our extreme version of proportional representation. And until we deal with that issue, I believe always that the base, a foundational point of all of our challenges and all of our problems is our system, our political system. Until we deal with that, until we have more inbuilt stability, you will give a lot of power to smaller parties in the name of ensuring that the prime minister, whoever that may be, their chief goal is stability, and that's what I believe.
We've got 6 or 7 more minutes, and there are 3 questions. So I'll get the questioners to ask their questions one after the other. Then I'll ask Ashley to respond to them all. Daria, then Ruth, then Alex. Daria.
Hi, Ashley. What do you say to those who claim that Bibi is pushing for certain reforms in order to avoid going to jail?
Ruth? Ruth, you're on mute. Ruth, you're still on mute. Oh, you can't hear me. Okay, yes, Ruth.
Okay, good evening, Ashley. Okay, you answered my second question satisfactorily, but what are the grievances, the unheard ones that you were talking about earlier, and why are they not heard?
And finally, Alex. Alex Klein.
Okay, thank you. I'm totally confused by the word Haredi and what you mean by ultra-Orthodox, because that's a perception that, because of the press and the way it is told, it's by the dress and the mode that you look like determines what you are, and by being very, very right-wing and an extremist doesn't necessarily make you Haredi. It's completely the opposite. A Haredi Jew is a pious Jew who keeps the mitzvot and the commandments according to loving his fellow man and according to the words of the Torah. These people, you're giving a misconception, and the same as the press is doing. Haredi means trembling, or to tremble. It comes from a root, and it has nothing to do with the way that people dress or riot or, you know, big beards and black hats. It's got nothing to do with that. Haredi and ultra-Orthodox are not what you say they are. They're completely the opposite.
Can we let Ashley answer now, please? Ashley, there's 3 questions.
Okay, I'll try and deal with the last question. First of all, the term Haredim is used by themselves. I'm trying to identify within the Haredi community, and I'm using the term which is used in Israel, and it was actually coined by that community themselves. So I'm not using the term ultra-Orthodox, like the term Orthodox is problematic from a Jewish point of view. It's a Christian term, Orthodox. So what does it mean to be ultra-Orthodox? And I completely understand the problem with many usages. I have a problem with the word modern Orthodox. I have a problem with, you know, we can all go into these terms and look at their genesis and find problems. But the word Haredi is one that is used in Israeli society. The people themselves use it, but within that society there are many degrees. I'm not saying that they all think one way, they all dress one way. Absolutely not. But in the Israeli political system, which they deem to represent that particular society, they do hold a particular belief. They do push for certain issues and certain policies, and they do hold, as I said, outsized influence at this point in the Israeli political system, because they will sit with both sides. They're one of the few sectors in Israeli society, if I could say that will sit with the left and the right, and they have done. They're not necessarily right-wing politically. They are actually moving more right-wing politically, because the Haredi community is moving out to the settlements. The fastest growing settlements at the moment in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the 3 largest are all ultra-Orthodox. Now, they didn't move there necessarily for ideological reasons or were built for ideological reasons, but this community needs more and more space. It needs more and more buildings. And it's a fast-growing community, and there's a lot more open spaces in Judea and Samaria than there are over the Green Line. So they are moving politically on the right, the average Haredi, according to every poll that I've seen. But the leaders will sit with the left, And if the rabbis of those communities say that we will sit with Benny Gantz tomorrow, they will sit with Benny Gantz. There's always that question, and it's unclear according to which party. Who leads here? Is it the politicians which are telling the rabbis what to say, or the rabbis are telling the politicians? I have a lot to say on this issue, but it would take up not only the other speakers' time, but every other. On the first question, I remember, is Bibi doing this because of his legal problems? It's impossible for me to get into his head. I would also have a lot to say on this. Those who know me know how I feel about this. But the bottom line is that that's certainly what opponents of judicial reform are saying, that this is being led by people who are in the midst of criminal investigations, or at the end of it, in the case of Aryeh Deri, and who've even been, convicted. And this is a way to weaken the Supreme Court and the justice system. What I will say to that is, in the midst of all this chaos, in the midst of all this back and forth, over the last few days, we are seeing laws that are allowing, but I haven't seen the exact wording of the law, but will allow prominent figures to have their criminal proceedings paid for by outside forces. At the moment, Netanyahu tried, and for a time, was allowing his cousin to pay for his defense, and that was deemed illegal by the Supreme Court, and they ruled that he had to pay it back, because that's obviously taking, as a civil servant, as an elected representative, you're not allowed to take gifts. And certainly that was seen as untoward in criminal cases where you're being questioned specifically on these issues of whether you took gifts or whether you gave favored decisions based on whether they did favors for you, or et cetera, et cetera. So considered inappropriate, illegal, et cetera. So now they're trying to pass a law that would overrule that would allow people to be paid back who use their own purse for legal proceedings, and it's clear who that's aimed at. Other things that are being dealt with at this present time, when the whole country is, as I said, in real chaos and tension, are doubling the budget that the Prime Minister gets for clothing, for all that sort of thing, is making sure that his 3 properties are looked after, et cetera, et cetera. So these are what seem to be motivating large parts of the coalition. So I can't get into Benjamin Netanyahu's head. He's one of the few very prominent Israeli politicians I've never worked with. So I can't get into his head, but certainly proponents are claiming that this really is at the root of Netanyahu's support for judicial reform. What was the second question? The unheard. I didn't fully understand.
What are the unheard grievances that you mentioned at the beginning that contributed to the unrest? Why don't we hear about
Well, basically, again, if you talk to the proponents of judicial reform, they say that what this really is about is trying to undo the democratic elections. They say, and by the way, there is some support for that. Again, if you speak to some of the leaders of the demonstrations, they say it's more than about judicial reform. You see all these, again, the Prime Minister demonstrations of a couple of years ago are really at the forefront of what is happening, and the right wing feels that what these demonstrations are really about is trying to undo the elections, really trying to make sure that the right gets the message that yes, you can win elections, yes, you can form a government, but you will not be able to control this country. That is what the right feel, that many of the demonstrators, of course, not the hundreds of thousands of people who are taken to the streets, but many of the people who are behind it are politically motivated, are using this as an opportunity. And that's what I'm hearing from people in the current coalition. And they say that's why they believe that much of it is illegitimate. But again, I'm just giving that point of view. I'm not professing it myself.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I'm now going to ask our Vice Chairman, Keith Rowe, to propose a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Ashley, on behalf of the NJA for coming online and talking to us this evening, for bringing us up to date in a really balanced way as to what is actually happening in Israel at the moment. We're all very concerned at what is clearly an extremely serious situation, and to hear from yourself a lot more of the detail of what's going on, and to put that into context of the history and the background has really brought it home to me, and I'm sure to everybody online this evening, really what a serious situation it is, but also that we understand it a lot more. The NJA has a view that we don't take a view on specific policies of Israeli governments. Other than being supportive of the state of Israel, we don't take a view. But it's extremely important that all of our members are well informed, understand what's going on, and are able to have our own views and be able to defend the state of Israel when we're talking to others. So thank you on behalf of everybody this evening. I do hope that you will remain in contact with the NJA, perhaps keep us updated on matters, and thank you again for talking to us this evening.
Thank you so much, Ashley. As I say, you're welcome to stage here, our next speaker.
Can I just give that little plug for my
yes, of course, please.
On every Wednesday, for those who are interested, I do give an update on what's going on in Israel, give a little bit more color on the weekly events. It's called Israel Insider. It takes place every Wednesday at 8 p.m. It's in conjunction with the Middle East Forum and JNS, and Dalia, I believe, will be sending a link. So you're welcome to join us every Wednesday at 8 o'clock UK time, and I'll be giving an update on what's going on that particular week. Not tomorrow because I'm traveling, but every other Wednesday, hopefully.
Ashley, once again, thank you so much. We really appreciated your contribution tonight. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you.
So we now come on to our next speaker, who is Yossi Saunders, who is the editor of the Jewish Weekly. Yossi started the Jewish Weekly in 2017, and together with his wife Miriam, he's built it up into a family newspaper with a 30,000 readership across the UK. Predominantly started to fill a gap between the left and the right wing, the Jewish Weekly sits to the right of centre politically and has been described by Ambassador Sippy Hottabelli as the most pro-Israel newspaper in the UK. Yossi is now going to share his thoughts with us on how he built the paper up from scratch, the challenges he faced, the good times, the fun times, and everything else in between. It's my great pleasure to welcome Yossi Saunders to the NJA. Yossi.
Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, it's always a good start. So first of all, I'd like to thank Gary, Dalia, and all the team for having me on. I know that we work very closely together with you every week, and I want to take the opportunity to say how amazing it is that you've got the NJA off the ground. I know exactly how difficult it is to start something new from scratch, as we will be talking about in the next few minutes. So kol hakavod, as we say in Ivrit, it's a lot of work, but you've definitely got the right team around you. And judging by the amount of press releases that you send us, there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. So keep it up, Gary, and I'm sure we will go make chayil el chayil from strength to strength, and you should all be blessed. I noticed there's a few familiar faces on, Alex Klein and Keith Rowe, two of my musical friends. Nice to see you, and we'll talk about my music background as well. So we recently celebrated our 6th anniversary at the Jewish Weekly a couple of weeks ago, and I do definitely pinch myself that it's been 6 years. And people very often will ask me, you know, why did you start a newspaper? And very often, usually about 1 o'clock in the morning on a deadline day, about Wednesday night, I will frequently ask myself, why did I start a newspaper? My wife certainly will ask me that. But in all seriousness, it's quite interesting. I actually have a musical background. I'm a chazan by trade. And in fact, Alex, who's on the Zoom tonight, gave me a scholarship several years ago to the Tel Aviv Cantorial Institute. So I was actually studying Chazanut under Cantor Naftali Hirschtick. And I then wound up in Leeds as a full-time Chazan in Beth HaMedrash HaGadol Synagogue with Rabbi Kleinman, if any of you know the shul. And we had a choir. And in fact, unfortunately, my choir master, Michael Saville, passed away yesterday, if any of you know him. He was a stalwart of the shul. And then I became the Chazan of Bushi for a year. Again, a lot of people seem to think Bushi is the biggest cemetery, but there's also a very live community there, the fourth biggest in the United Synagogue. You know, I enjoyed doing it for several years. And obviously, as the family grew, you want to sort of live in a place that's better suited for kids. And I always had a business side to me as well. So I decided to do part-time freelance chazanut, which is where I met Keith in Birmingham. He was our choir master there for a few years. And we decided to go into business. So I actually had a cleaning business, which I had in London and in Jerusalem. And we had that for several years. And then I decided I wanted to do something that was more fulfilling. So if there's any Jewish women that don't want to hear the word Pesach, sorry to remind you, we are very close, but you'll know that cleaning for Pesach is something you don't want to think about. And that's where we sort of made our business. But eventually we got to a stage where I wanted to do something that gave back and really made a difference in people's lives. So romantic as it sounds, the Jewish Weekly was actually born on Margate Beach, which is probably not what you thought, I would say. Amongst all the litter and crisp packets and beer bottles, the newspaper was formed. My wife was in Israel at a friend's wedding, and my mum had come down to help me while she was out, and we wound up at Margate Beach. It was a you know, typical English summer's day, 10 degrees, cloudy, but we went to the beach, and she took the kids for a bit, and I just bought a new book from Paul McKenna, if any of you are familiar with him, and the book is entitled I Will Make You Rich. He's also got another book entitled I Will Make You Thin. I'm still working on that one, but the I Will Make You Rich book, he basically said in there, take things that you know, that you love, that you enjoy, and turn it into a business and just write down ideas. So I started writing down several ideas, and I narrowed it down to 2. Got on the phone to my wife in Israel. The first idea, which I literally dreamed up on that beach, and I thought, if any of you have ever had to drive north of Watford, for you Londoners, you might know there is something north of Watford in England. You might have stopped on the service stations. I see Keith that's grinning. I'm sure all the times you travel down to Westminster for all the dues, you know, without going into too much detail.
Birmingham is north of Watford.
Birmingham is north, yes, as is Manchester. Without going into too much gory details, and I don't know about the ladies, but certainly in the men's section, it's not always so clean when you need to use the services, shall we say. And I thought of having a self-cleaning cubicle, and I came up with this whole idea of coming in and everything's all steam clean and it's fresh. And my wife said to me, she says, we are not spending the rest of our lives on the M1, forget it. Of course, we Googled it and we saw that it's all over Japan. If any of you have ever been there or have business there, every service station in Japan, exactly what I thought. Just Google it, you'll see steam comes out, it's all beautiful. So she said, what's your other idea? And I said, I think there's a gap in the market for a new Jewish newspaper. And she said, let's do it. Now, perhaps that was the wine talking, she was at a wedding, but she said, you know, let's start this project. And we spent several months working on the idea. The main reason why I thought we could do it, apart from obviously having a background, we thought that we knew community very well. Having worked in Leeds, having worked in Project Seed, who do outreach to people, and having, you know, done community work, we were used to community. We put large-scale events on, and we hosted big international figures. We had somebody who was part of the Entebbe raid, so we were used to the community life. And from my cleaning business days, I was used to selling. So I thought, let's combine the two and make a difference to people's lives. So we had a look and we saw that the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News were tending to become, they were leaning towards the left, you know, they were becoming more and more, to be frank, anti-Israel, which is very sad. But for example, there was a few things which really made my decision. There was an article that appeared in the Jewish Chronicle one week saying that they were ashamed to be Jewish because of the fighting with Gaza. And a few years ago, Jewish News had an article from Rabbi Leah Jordan, who said that she was proud to have led a Kaddish for Hamas terrorists outside Westminster, because even though they kill Jewish people, Jewish men, women, babies, but we're all human. And I was thinking that it was just ridiculous. And I thought, this should be stopped. And in fact, I actually spoke to somebody who told me that in Australia, the chief rabbinate of Australia closed the Jewish Chronicle of Australia down because of similar things. I can't verify that, but that was the type of thing I thought that nobody seems to care. And then you had very right-wing Haredi papers, the Hamadiyah, the Jewish Tribune, which don't put pictures of women in and are they disagree with Israel from the other point of view. So I thought we needed something that agreed with Israel, with the state of Israel, and most importantly, with Israel's right to defend itself. That doesn't mean, and I'm not going to tread on the previous talk, and of course it's on everyone's mind, but that doesn't mean you agree with every single decision that comes out of the Knesset. I don't think anybody does. And I lived in Rehavia in Jerusalem for 4 years, right opposite the Knesset. We looked out on the beautiful the valley, and we saw the Knesset there. But you have to agree that it is a disgrace, quite frankly, in a Jewish newspaper in this country to slam them when they defend themselves. And the idea was born, and we spent several months putting together a proper business plan. We got investors, and we launched on the 1st of March 2017. And I still remember picking up the phone to organizations, telling them that we're making a new newspaper, introducing ourselves. They all thought we were completely crazy. And all the soothsayers, I'm sure, Gary, you've had similar at NJA, they said, oh, you won't last 6 weeks. Thank God we just had our 6th anniversary. So I think the one lesson that you've learned is never listen to any negativity, because you can do anything you want if you put your mind to it, if you are prepared to put in a lot of sheer hard work, and you have a goal and a focus, and it helps if you're slightly crazy as well. So I think the main question people ask me is, how do you fill it every week? How do you go from lying on Margate Beach, let's make a newspaper, to having 10,000 copies every single week around the UK? This week's paper going out tomorrow night, we've got a charity supplement, we've got a Pesach food and wine supplement, and it's going to be 88 pages. So how do you go to 88 pages? And it's very simple. Jewish people love stuff for free. It might come as a shock to you. So because we're a free paper, the readers, once they'd seen the paper a few times, and they became accustomed to picking it up in their local shop, whether they're doing their Shabbat shopping or their newsagent. We have stands outside the tubes. Once they've seen it a few times, it becomes regular, and they just pick it up by habit. My favorite phone calls of the week, apart from obviously the advertisers, are when the little old ladies call me up in a panic and say, my newsagent's run out of papers, what am I supposed to do? It's Shabbat in a couple of hours. In fact, we once had talking about old ladies, we once had an old lady who called us up and said that her grandchildren, bless them, were in the paper several weeks ago. Do we have any copies? Can she come and pick it up? And I said, by all means, come to the office. We were based in Temple Fortune at the time. So I said, yeah, I'm in the office till 5, pop over. A few hours later, she comes in, and I just casually said, where have you come from? She said, oh, I've come from the East End. I've had buses, I've had tubes. I said, what? She goes, yeah, she spent 2.5 hours coming to us. I said, I feel sick. I said, do you want to lift home? And she goes, no. She goes, I'm just delighted to meet you, meet the team, meet the staff, have a cup of tea. And it was like a day out for her. So that always sort of stuck in the memory. But we you know, Israel and politics aside, how have we made a difference? We saw there was a gap in the market for a very, very good family and kids section. So in fact, our strap line every week is the family newspaper. And we have games, we have jokes, we have riddles, crosswords. We've had people coming up to us. I was at the Ajax parade a few months ago with my daughters, proudly marching through central London. You know, if I could bottle that moment and just to get my kids, you know, keeping quiet for half an hour was legendary. But at the parade, there was a woman there with her kids, and she told us that her son, who's slightly autistic, but every Friday night he stands up at the table, and his contribution to the Shabbat table is reading out our jokes and our riddles and doing the dingbats and doing the crosswords. And in fact, you know, when we started the paper, we were living in London at the time for the first couple of years, and then we moved to Manchester. Again, we felt we could run the paper from north of Watford. Property was cheaper, and I do a lot of traveling. But when we were in London, I used to go to Kinloss, which was across the road, and there was a 96-year-old man, a Welsh man. If any of you dabble in Kinloss, I don't know if he's still with us. You might know who I am, but he was a big character. And every week, without fail, he would come up to me and go, Yossi, I can't work out the dingbats. And I'd say to him every week, they're on the answers are on the bottom, upside down. And he just never seemed to get this. And he was always really frustrated. So I say to clients, which is absolutely true, we have literally, you know, a 100-year-old age range. We have like 5-6-year-old children who are raising £3 for their local school in a, you know, lemonade stand outside their house. And that will go on our front page one week. And then the next week, Jewish Care will send us a, you know, 106-year-old lady's birthday party, and you know, card from the Queen or now the King. So we have a very large age range, and that's because we have something for everybody. We're not a controversial newspaper. We try not to upset people. Again, it always fascinates me how clients tell me that they've spent so much money with other papers, and then they'll find themselves on the front page one week. You know, we try to build relationships rather than utterly destroy them. But there's something in there for everybody. We have a women's section, we have cooking, we have travel. You know, there's a pandemic going on, and then like we see both sides of the community. So we see, you know, the abject poverty, extreme poverty across the community, people that call up the office and say, you know, we're living in Israel because our paper's online as well as 10,000 papers a week. In England, we do about 10,000 online. So we have readers all over the world. And there's a lady from Israel who says that she's a widow and she has nothing to eat, and can we put a free advert in for her for a bit of charity? We have that side. We have charities in London such as Gift, who deliver food, and they tell us that they go to some very, very wealthy roads in northwest London, you know, in their words, very, very big houses with several big cars in the driveway, and they are dropping off packets of food because they're having pasta and cereal over Shabbat, because the house might have been an inheritance, or they might have paid the mortgage off, and then suddenly they lose their job, and then they don't have the cash flow to buy food, but they're too embarrassed to either tell their parents or their children. These are very real cases. So we get to see at the paper, we get to see both sides of life. We get to see, you know, the tremendous good that is done across the community. And then we get to see the other side. So we have many, many travel adverts, especially now for Pesach. It's the new craze to go to hotels and spend £300 million for a week, and you know, anywhere. Literally, they go to Dubai, they go to Vietnam these days. You know, why stay in England when you can do Pesach in Egypt, which is sort of defeats the whole point. But people are spending a fortune, 25, 30 grand for, you know, for all their family. So we see both sides, and the newspaper caters to both sides. So we have clientele who will say to me, look, you know, it's 20 grand for Pesach. So we want readers that have that sort of gelt, or we want readers who might be perhaps a bit frail to make Pesach on their own, but they'll spend that money. And then again, as we said, we have the other side. So we have made a difference to people's lives. We've made a difference to people's Shabbat table. We've brought families together, as I said, from the youth to the former youth, to be polite. You know, we've got an attractive readership now, a magnet for our advertisers. But most importantly of all, and what makes me the proudest, is when, you know, Ambassador Hotovelli and her predecessor, Mark Greger, they both said to us that we were the most pro-Israel paper in the UK. You know, my family are looking to potentially make Aliyah ourselves. We lived in Israel before we got married and when we started. So, you know, we believe that as a Jew, it doesn't matter how religious you are or you're not, but Israel should be in your blood. And it still to this very day baffles me how Jewish newspapers that are more than happy to go out and chase adverts from Israeli hotels and whatever, but yet they will destroy them every week. And we see it in the letters that we get and the letters that we don't publish. I would say the paper we don't publish every week is probably more fascinating than the one that we do. We know a lot of stuff, what goes on. Most of it would probably get sued if we published. But we do get to see some very, very interesting stuff. And of course, running the paper does allow you access to some of the most important people in the world. I once saw a statistic that every single person in the world is only 6 people away from the president of America if they want. And I actually put that theory to the test. For those readers who follow our paper every week for the last few years, you would have seen the tragic case of little Alta Fixter, who was a little girl who was born in Manchester, and she was basically brain dead, and they put her on a life support machine. And unfortunately, her parents battled with the hospital, and it dragged through courts. And this went on for a long, long time, for years. And ultimately, one of the top judges in England ruled that she has to die, that it's a drain on resources. And it went to the European Court of so-called human rights, who said, no, we must switch it off as well. And we got him, you know, just out of the goodness of our heart, I picked up the phone, I called up the father, we spoke to him, and we said, let's help you. Let's do a campaign. So my PA and I sat down, literally one day, and we filled out on change.org a petition to petition the government to step in. And remarkably, we got 50,000 signatures. I mean, this went to the president of America. Like, we had rabbis in America calling me up 1 hour before Shabbat, telling me that our petition has made noise, that they had, I think, 18 plus senators, people high up in Congress, people in America, powerful, who had petitioned the White House to offer little Alta and her parents safe passage to America on a Hatzolah plane. So that's a medical plane that she would have flown on and still been on life support, fully funded. They would have given her a passport, visa, the whole thing. And they turned around and said, we will take her in to America, and we believe that we have hospitals here that might be able to save her. Remarkably, the King of England, who at the time, of course, was still Prince Charles, he wrote a letter in the Times, and this was sort of the level that this story attracted. The president of Israel wrote in, and Israel said that they would also take her in, and they passionately believed that they had the technology to save her. So we ended up with America and Israel at government and president senior level saying, we've got the money, we've got the backing, we'll take her. We spoke to the government here, we spoke to Sajid Javid, and representatives spoke to Boris, and the government didn't want to know. Nothing to do with us, the government, nothing to do with the law, it's to do with the judge. And unfortunately, she died in the end. But the Shabbat before, we had people calling us saying, look, at any point you might get a phone call. If she's allowed, if the government do a U-turn, if they step in, you're allowed to break Shabbat, keep your phone on you. I went to synagogue with my phone in my pocket on silent. My rabbi, who doubles up as my father, said, he said, do it, you could save a life. And it was very exciting. Of course, the phone didn't ring, which was obviously very upsetting. But we had like Can 11 News in Israel phoning us up, asking for quotes. So it's amazing how, you know, the Jewish Weekly, which was born on Margate Beach amongst all the crisp packets and the litter and, you know, under the clouds, you know, we've become a serious noise, you know, internationally as well as across the country. And we're very proud, my wife and I are very proud that our hard work, Baruch Hashem, has paid off. We couldn't do it without our staff. Our staff are amazing. They all work 20 times more than they should, which has nothing to do with me pushing them, of course. They do it for the pure love of the newspaper. And the nicest thing is, you know, when we sit down over Shabbat and we know that there are 30,000 people over the weekend who will be reading through our newspaper. And when the, you know, the phone call comes in from the little lady who lives in Hamsagon suburbs, on her own, is disabled, can't leave her flat, and says that her son drops a newspaper off every Friday and it makes her feel part of the community. Well, to us, you know, that's worth all the long nights. And when I asked myself, why did I start a newspaper? We actually, my wife and I, we look at each other with pride, and the sky's the limit. Don't know where this will go. So again, I welcome any questions. I hope we've given you a little flavor of how we did it, and most importantly, why. And I believe in any business, you know, if you have a why, then you will find the how.
Yossi, thank you ever so much. Can I see questions, please? Remember to raise your virtual hand. I think Ruth Hart, you had a question. Or Paul Hart, one of you.
Hi, Yossi.
Hi, how are you?
Very interesting to listen to you.
Thank you.
First thing, how do you plan what goes into the paper?
We are absolutely inundated, and Gary knows this because we had a good old haggle over a advert package recently. We are inundated every single week. I mean, we're talking about every school in the country, every charity. They'll just send in anything. So to give you live examples today, you know, we've had a charity packing stuff off to Ukraine. We're talking to Magen David Adam about their flights that have gone out to Turkey. And then as I was switching off to come on here, I got a phone call from the NHS who want to do a new round of advertising and editorial about a polio vaccine. There is so much stuff. At the moment, we are turning stuff away rather than struggling to put stuff in. It's, you know, the fact that there are so many readers and that it's free, people love it. And thank God. I mean, if we had the funds, we would do 100 pages a week plus every single week.
Thank you. Thank you. Alex.
Hi, Yossi. Thank you very much for your kind words, and you know what your family and your success means to us and our family. Thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. Relationships with other newspapers. Do you find that because you're successful and because you have a niche in the market and the other newspapers do, are they sort of envious, or do you get repercussions or advertising saying, if you deal with this paper, you can't deal with our paper, and so on and so forth, or we want exclusivity and therefore non-persona gratis and things of that nature, which is, it's not very nice, but it may happen. So what's your views on that, and does it happen?
It's very interesting. I mentioned, Alex, during the last half hour, you might recall I said the paper we don't print every week is more interesting than the one we do. I could argue the Zoom talk that I don't give is more interesting than the one that I do. I'm not going to mention any names because I've not got my lawyer with me. But unfortunately, yes, there is a lot of newspaper wars. You know, when we came along, we literally came out of nowhere. We took the others by surprise. We were the first new Jewish newspaper in the UK in over 20 years. And again, you know, when people were telling us, look, you're not going to last 6 weeks, we know for a fact, because clients told us, that the other papers were all over them saying, please don't advertise, that these guys are not going to last, you know, and there were stuff going on. What's interesting, again, with no names, is a particular individual who happens to be a newspaper editor of a rival paper. I actually ended up in Israel with him on a tour, because some of the charities offer us tours. In fact, the sort of travel opportunities the paper have had in the last 6 months alone have included, as well as Israel, have included Dubai, Warsaw, Prague, Malta, and you know, there's a lot of opportunity. So of course, I ended up on this trip around Israel, and we ended up drinking wine together in a winery, and it was all very nice. But ever since then, whenever he sees me, he completely and utterly blanks me. It's like I'm invisible. So there is a lot that goes on, but we just focus on our own paper. We don't really look at them too much, because if you spend your whole time looking over your shoulder, as well as being severely anxious and depressed, you're not going to focus on being the best that you can be.
Do you get any problems from right-wing orthodoxy, being a family, coming from a family of Rabbonim and an Orthodox background like you have, and knowing your family very, very well, and your brother's a rabbi in Florida? Do you get problems from the right wing, so to speak, in inverted commas, saying you shouldn't print this, you shouldn't do this, and trying to tell you what you should do, and how difficult it is in your situation with your family, ignoring those facts and doing a brilliant job in what you do?
You're very kind. I mean, it's interesting, because when we thought of the paper, we looked at the JC and the Jewish News and the Jewish Telegraph sort of towards the left, and we looked at the Hamadiyya and the Jewish Tribune towards the right. And we wanted to be in the middle of those two. So what that means is we pick up some advertisers from both sets. So we will get very orthodox schools, yeshivas, seminaries, charities, who would never dream of ever spending in Jewish Chronicle, but will come with us. We've had people who say we're never spending with Jewish News again because they're always slamming Israel, you know, pogroms, all these things. We do get that. So we pick up a bit of the right wing. And we also pick up, on the other side of the coin, we have people that will say to our face, look, you know, we were in the paper the other week, and you frumified us, you know, because we were wearing a skirt that did not look that long. And we always say, you know, we editors' discretion is that we have a, you know, a certain boundary, and they like it from both sides. What we also know is that because we're in the middle, it will mean that you don't get everything. So again, we have some people that, because we put pictures of women in our paper, will never spend a penny with us. We passionately believe that women, well, I mean, women exist, that half the people in the world are women. So, you know, to blot them out is ridiculous. I mean, when we started the paper, I actually had lunch with the editor of the Hamadiyya. And I said to him, you know, more nonchalantly, but with a serious undertone, I said, what's going to happen when the Queen dies? And he turned around to me, he goes, we'll put the flag at half-mast. And of course, when she died, they didn't in the end. They actually put a picture of Prince Charles looking at flowers. But I was thinking, you know, come on, this is the Queen. You know, the biggest event to happen to this country since Man United won the treble. I mean, come on, you've got to put the Queen on your front page. And, you know, it was interesting because the day that the Queen died, I always had one rule with my staff. I said, look, you know, when the paper's off, that's it. You know, if it's 2, 3 in the morning, that's it. You're done. Go to bed and we'll pick up. I said, but if the Queen ever dies, I'm waking you up. And anybody that's ever worked for us knows that, you know, whether you're a designer or a journalist, the Queen dies, you're being woken up and rushed to put stuff together. And of course, we had stuff already on the tap. And of course, what happened was, when the Queen died, that week happened to be a week where we had asked to print a day later because of the way it fell around the week. It's actually an interesting story, because our print slot is usually Wednesday night at midnight, and the paper's delivered from about 3 o'clock in the morning on a Thursday around the country. That week, and you see how Hashem works, we were in France on a family holiday, and we drove, And literally in the middle of the trip, something went in the car, and we had to get the car, you know, through the insurance. They took it to a garage, and they gave us a courtesy car. And the garage took longer than usual. So we decided to stay in France for another weekend. Instead of going back on the Thursday, we went back on Monday. And because we came back on Monday, I said to the staff, I said, you know what, let's have another day. Let's get the paper out Thursday night rather than Wednesday night. Of course, on Thursday morning, the Jewish Chronicle and Jewish News were already out with a whole anti-Semitism headline. And I get a WhatsApp, Queens, you know, the whole thing. And the moment I saw that, and you know, Charles and William are flying to the palace, and even Harry's, I'm like, oh my gosh, she's dead. Like, they're just announcing it slowly. I said to myself, she's definitely dead. And one of my staff was like, no, 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 she's not dead. I said, she will be dead before Mincha time. Like, there's no way. The problem was, we had a print slot at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So we made this whole front cover, you know, the chief rabbi wishes her refuah shalema, and we sent it off to the printers. And I thought, she better not die before the weekend, because I'm going to look like a right, you know, imagine the Queen dies and my paper's wishing her refuah shalema over Shabbos in the shops. So we sent it to the printers, and about half an hour later, it came out that she passed away. And I thought, oh, you know, oy vey, what are we going to do? I called the printers. Now, the printers, the second your print slot comes, they're on the phone, you know, 12:01 a.m., they're on the phone. Where's the paper? Where's the paper? I thought, I'm going to try it. So I called them up. They said, no, we've not printed yet. Redo your cover. You've got 20 minutes. Got all the team on the phone. Everyone's screaming at each other for 20 minutes. We changed it. It's actually quite hard. You know, Chief Rabbi wishes refuah shalema, Chief Rabbi condolences. You know, it's hard to change in 20 minutes a front page. And we were actually the first printed newspaper in the UK with the news of a death before any national paper. So that's a pointless and useless statistic. But yes, the newspaper battles, we try and keep quiet.
Yossi, thank you so much. And I'm going to ask Keith Rowe, our Vice Chairman, to propose a vote of thanks. Keith. Keith,
Yossi, thank you. I'm unmuted now. Thank you so much for coming online and talking to us this evening. As someone who's been, although albeit in a different marketplace entirely, where you've been in starting a business from scratch, it's very interesting to hear your story, to see how you've made a success of it, and may you go from strength to strength. I'm a little bit gutted to hear what such bad condition Margate Beach is in, and I think perhaps you need to run some sort of campaign with the county council there to try and get the beer cans and the cigarette ends cleared up, because clearly you're not doing a great job.
You know how to deal with council, yeah.
But anyway, oh well, one other thing I wanted to say to you is, you said about we first met with the singing and the music, and it's been great knowing you through that. I'm still the choir master at Singers Hill, by the way. We're still so far at least going strong, and hopefully we'll see you in Birmingham again. We don't get the Jewish news very often in Birmingham, though, and you did say that you distributed the paper widely across the world, but apart from being online, you know, you obviously stop at Watford or somewhere where you had the issue with the toilets. So, you know, do think of us when you're distributing your papers, because we'd like to see some of the riddles and other stuff as well that may not be online. But on behalf of everybody at the NJA, thank you so much for giving us your personal story. It's really appreciated, and we look forward to being featured in your paper regularly.
Thank you so much, Keith, and thank you, Yossi. And Yossi, you're welcome to stay and listen to Dr. Alan Mendoza, who's our next speaker. You're very welcome to stay. And is Alan here? I think Alan is.
Yes, I'm here. I'm here.
Oh, good to hear your voice, Alan, and good to see you. So I'm going to introduce Alan now, and then I'll hand things over to him.
Gary, I'm probably about 2 minutes away from you, literally.
Oh, I think I know where you are in that case.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, our final guest speaker this evening is Dr. Alan Mendoza, who's going to talk about Iran and the spotlight on the global threat that Iran poses. Alan is the co-founder and the executive director of the Henry Jackson Society, which is Britain's leading think tank fighting for the principles and alliances which keep societies free. He directs the strategy for the organisation, as well as acting as its main public face in mediums as diverse as the BBC, Sky, CNBC, Al Jazeera, Bloomberg, LBC, and Talk Radio. I think there are quite a few others I know, actually. They're probably not on that list I've heard you on. Alan will speak about the current situation with Iran, covering everything from the recent women's protests, the ongoing nuclear threat posed by the regime, and its continued threat to Israel. Alan, over to you.
Well, thank you, Gary, and a real pleasure to be addressing you all tonight and having a chat about this very, very fraught subject of Iran. Before I begin, just remind me, what time do you want to close the meeting? Because I don't want to overrun with comments. And I want some time for questions.
For about 20 minutes, and we'll have about probably 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
Fine. So looking for about half 9. We're looking for the whole set. Good. So I don't want to keep anyone from their other pursuits this evening. So let me first say about how nice it is to see the NJA up and running and to have another representative body. I'm not being sarcastic. Some people say, oh, there's so many representative bodies in Anglo-Jewry. Actually, it's a really important thing to have representation, I think. And there have obviously been sort of different camps, shall we say, emerge in various different organizations. Some of you will know, for example, my wife is the CEO of the Jewish Leadership Council. But I don't think anyone sees the NJA as a threat or a problem in that regard. I think, let 1,000 flowers bloom, to use the phrase, because I think that the more discussion we have, the more debate, the better it is. And certainly the more discussion debate we have Iran, the better it is, because actually we do face a very serious threat from Iran. And what I'd like to do is take you through a little bit of it to understand, firstly, what Iran is doing on its nuclear plan. Secondly, what Iran is doing regionally. Thirdly, what Iran is doing on global terrorism. And tying all that in is really a question of, does this regime actually have that long to live? And so if we start with the nuclear file, the reason why Iran is a global threat, this sort of notion of the global problem, is that, of course, for many years now, it has been attempting to develop certainly nuclear capabilities, but we all believe, and with good reason, judging by the fact that the Israelis were able to make off with most of the nuclear files some years ago, that Iran is actually, of course, trying to build a nuclear weapon.
Alan, your voice is gone.
Oh, can you hear me? Have you lost me?
Now we can.
Hello? Can you hear me now? Oh,
yes.
I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to reduce the quality of my video here because there's sometimes a problem with that. Let me just take myself off high definition. That may help. Right. Let's see if that will improve the quality. So I was saying on the nuclear front, the reason Iran is a global threat is because it's trying to develop nuclear capabilities and specifically nuclear weapons. And we know this to be the case because, as I said, the Israelis have stolen a whole set of files in one of the most audacious robberies in recent times. You'll recall a few years ago, Bibi turns up on a stage with all these nuclear files around him and he starts pulling them off, showing what Iran's been up to over the past X number of years. So we know they're trying to build a bomb. Now, this is bad for many reasons. It's bad in general because we don't want nuclear proliferation. In general, the fewer nuclear weapons in the world, the better. We certainly don't want new states to get nuclear weapons, and certainly not if they have the kind of aggressive ideology that Iran has, anchored together with threats to destroy various of its neighbors, principally the Zionist entity, which we would know better as Israel. So there's obviously a great concern with this in general. How has Iran been doing this? Well, it's been a long path. The Iranian nuclear program stretches over, a long period of time, well over 2 decades in its current incarnation. And what Iran has obviously been attempting to do is to enrich uranium. Now, you'll know that to get to a nuclear weapons stage in uranium enrichment, you have to firstly start by spinning uranium. You do that in centrifuges, and you have to sort of enrich it to certain purity levels. And there are various stages of purity that you get to. The first sort of 20% is always the hardest because it's the toughest to get that right at the beginning of the whole sort of planning, preparation of nuclear technology to get to that stage. And then eventually you're going up to about 90%, which is your nuclear weapons grade material. And there are bits in between that enable you to do that. Now, over many years, Iran has successfully got to 20%, got beyond 20%, and all been, under the eyes of the international community. In fact, we now believe that Iran is probably it's not confirmed, but Iran's probably at the stage of being able to achieve a nuclear breakout. It's been doing this for so long and with such success that most intelligence services believe they've got enough expertise and enough enriched uranium to build a bomb or two if they put their mind to it and to do that. Now, as I said, the shocking thing about this is that it's occurred under the watch of the international community. We've known about Iran's nuclear program since at least 2003, when the Iranians came clean. One of the interesting things about the Iraq war was that it convinced the Iranians at the time, when Saddam was toppled, that actually they would have to come clean about their nuclear intentions. And they sort of said, oh, we've got a nuclear program, by the way, but we're willing to stop it if you leave us alone in those terms. And then the Americans put sanctions on them. There was a whole set of discussions trying to get them in. That period lasted about 12 years before Barack Obama, when he was US president, of course, brought together a nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, back in 2015-16. And what that was supposed to do was to basically put Iran's nuclear program into stasis. Now, the problem with that deal, so that Iran would basically stop enriching beyond a certain level, it would not bring any more centrifuges online, all the rest of it. Now, the problem with the deal, and why it wasn't universally welcomed by people, because normally you would think a deal that would stop nuclear proliferation would be welcome. The problem with it was that, number one, there were lots of carve-outs for Iran. Military bases were not included. They were allowed to continue to develop their missile technology. There was also the inspection process was very haphazard. You had to tell them many days in advance that you were coming. There'd be no surprise inspections, etc. And crucially, there were sunset clauses to the deal that after certain periods of time, 10 years, 15 years, Iran would be allowed to expand its nuclear provisions anyway. And this, of course, led to Donald Trump tearing up the American side of the deal back in 2018. He said, look, this deal is not worth the paper it's printed on. We're going to come out of it. And he initiated a program of maximum pressure on Iran, trying very hard to force the country to submission through a combination of sanctions and secondary sanctions and other matters to stop the Iranian program. Now, the problem with Trump's approach is that the other parties to the deal, particularly the Europeans, but also China and Russia, did not participate in the sanctions. And indeed, we've had a crazy situation for the last 4 to 5 years where Iran has broken every provision in the nuclear deal, which should have led to us snapping back sanctions on them, and we haven't done so. So Iran's been able to continue with its nuclear program. Yes, it's had American sanctions. Yes, there have been some other bits and pieces that have been put on that have restricted trade, and Iran's economy is certainly not in a good place, but it hasn't been brought to its knees because not everyone's joined in with this debate. And as a result, it's got to the stage now where, despite a lot of activity on the ground, and every now and again you see scientists being assassinated, other people being knocked off, explosions going off in Iran, which we believe are all being done by a combination of Mossad and the CIA. Even though all that's happened, Iran has got to this sort of breakout point. Now, that doesn't mean that Iran is about to build a nuclear weapon. And there are 2 reasons for this. The first is, if they actually do it, they become a declared nuclear state and everything kind of changes. And there's a whole set of things that will befall them, i.e. there will be sanctions worldwide on them, and there are lots of problems there. The second reason they won't want to do that just yet is they don't have the delivery mechanism for a nuclear bomb. It's one thing building it, but if you can't get it somewhere and actually weaponize it, there's no point to building it. So what Iran has been doing for many years is developing its missile technology, ballistic missiles, and trying to, kind of get a greater range on its missiles and the ability to put a bigger payload, if you like, on the top of the missile, including, of course, a nuclear payload to be able to deliver it. And it's, of course, when they finally perfect that part, then they can build a bomb, and then we will all be, of course, in trouble, because that means it'll be potentially operational and they'll have joined that nuclear status. So we think there's probably about 18 months to 2 years before they can do that latter bit, which takes us into a very difficult piece of territory, obviously, which is, what do you do with a country which is on the edge of a nuclear breakout, hasn't got its missile technology sorted, and you don't appear to be able to diplomatically, kind of resolve this? It leads you to the conclusion that there will need to be some kind of military action to knock out this program or set it back again in order to stop the Iranians from reaching this stage. And so we leave this part of the discussion on this sort of point of tenterhooks, where we know Iran has progressed in a nuclear way. We know that they haven't got far enough to weaponize it, but we don't know how to stop them from doing that bit. And as a result, that is, of course, creating great instability in the region and beyond, because were Iran to become a nuclear state, all of us would have cause to fear, because yes, Iran hates Israel, but it hates its Arab neighbors, it hates us in the UK, it hates the US and many others as well. So you don't particularly want that country developing there. Now then let's look at the next stage, the sort of regional problems Iran poses. So, okay, it's got a global potential nuclear threat in that way. Regionally, it's clearly a destabilizing force. Now, why do I say this? Because if you look at what's actually happening in the Middle East, in particular, the trends in the Middle East over the past 20 years, actually what you've seen is the great destabilizing force in the Middle East is Iran, not Israel. You often heard this old phrase, oh, if we only solved the issue of peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Middle East would be peaceful and quiet. Well, no one believes that. No one sensible believes that today. It may have been true, 40 years ago. It wasn't even true then, but, you could make that claim with some sort of, pretense at having a, kind of a sense of understanding of the region. But that's nowhere near true today, because if you look at all the conflicts in the region and the rivalries in the region, they go through Tehran, not through Jerusalem. So the first situation you've got is that, of course, there is a conflict, if you like, between Iran and Israel. It's a conflict that's a Cold War, essentially. It occasionally heats up. The reason there's that conflict is because Iran cannot fathom the idea of a Jewish state in the Middle East. And we know, for example, that many of Israel's Arab neighbors have now come to the realization that this is a normal thing to have in the region, and it's not even a problem, it's a benefit. But Iran is not at that stage. So it's menacing towards Israel. And of course, what it does is support the Palestinian militant groups of various kinds. Hamas gets aid from it, Islamic Jihad gets aid from it, Hezbollah on the northern border gets aid from it. And as a result, it creates tension, of course, between Israel and Iran through that. And there are games that Iran plays to always, kind of attempt to knock Israel down. But it's not simply Israel. Iran is also at loggerheads with its Sunni Arab rivals. So just to remind ourselves here, Iran is a Shia Muslim state. There was, of course, a big divide in Islam, but many years ago in the 7th, 8th centuries between the Shias and the Sunnis. Iran today is the largest Shia Muslim power in the world, and that puts it at odds with many of its neighbors who are largely Sunni Arab states. And there is therefore a conflict in the Middle East between the Sunni factions and the Shia factions. Now, how this presents itself is simply that wherever there are Shias in the Middle East, Iran is there to foment dissent and cause problems. I'll give you some examples. In Iraq is a country split between Shias, Sunnis, and Kurds. The Shias are the largest group, and as a result, the Iranians have, for many years, tried to insert themselves in Iraqi politics and causing problems there. And if anyone, by the way, is interested in this particular aspect, we at the Henry Jackson Society tomorrow are hosting not tomorrow, on Thursday, are hosting at lunchtime an Iraqi politician called Mithan al-Alusi, who will discuss in depth what is going on with Iran in the neighborhood, basically. But Iran interferes in Iraq, it interferes in Lebanon, which also has a significant Shia population. It interferes in Syria. Why in Syria? Because although the Shias are not a large number in Syria, they are allied to Bashar al-Assad's regime. And he's basically kept in power by the Iranians and by the Russians. And so they interfere there. They also interfere in numerous near neighbors of theirs. In Yemen, for example, you'll be aware there is a civil war going on, but it's not really a civil war. It's actually a war being fought by proxy between the Saudis on the one hand and the Iranians on the other, one backing a Sunni faction, one backing a Shia faction. And indeed, in Saudi Arabia, in Bahrain, in other of the countries in the region, what the Iranians also do is foment dissent among the Shia populations and cause internal disturbances to those powers. And ultimately, it's a power battle between Iran, essentially as the leader of the Shia bloc, and Saudi Arabia as the leader of the Sunni bloc, trying to jockey for, if you like, position within Middle Eastern Islam as who is the most powerful force there. So you've got that regional destabilizing factor as well. And then, of course, we have the terrorism factor. Now, this is both a localized factor in the Middle East, because, of course, as we've discussed already, Iran backs and supports with weapons and money some of the Palestinian groups. It supports and backs with money Hezbollah, which is entirely its creation. But, of course, it also has extended its terrorist operations in other areas as well. We know that some of the Iraqi militias, when British and American troops were on the ground there, were being attacked by essentially Iranian irregular forces with Iranian weapons in that sort of way. We know as well in Afghanistan that Iranian weapons were used there in various functions. And of course, sadly, we've seen that Iran's terrorist writ goes far beyond the Middle East as well. We will know, you'll all remember the terrible incident in Buenos Aires when the Jewish Community Center was bombed in 1994 with mass loss of life. We know as well, of course, of the terrorist attack in Bulgaria. And we know of other examples where the Iranians have been trying to assassinate enemies of theirs in European countries. We know at one stage there was an attempt by Iran to kill British parliamentarians and others attending an opposition function rally in Paris. And we've also had other examples of the Iranians trying to kill other Arab state leaders and others in various countries in the world, including in the USA, in fact, where there was an Iranian plot to kill one of the Saudi leading forces, one of the ambassadors or the people in the embassy there. So you've got this constancy of Iranian threat on a terrorist level globally, which brings us, of course, into the era of what entities are doing this. So in Iran, you've got, of course, the government, which is a theocracy, and you've got a group called the Islamic Guards Revolutionary Corps, which is the, if you like, the shock troops of the revolution. These are the hardcore elite of the revolution, and these are the people who keep it going internally. They're the real ideologues, and they're the ones who have the real power, and they are the elite forces in the military, but they also control the terrorist side of it through things like the Quds Force and others internationally. And so recently, there of course has been a kind of a global attempt to start imposing sanctions at the very least on the IRGC, but also hopefully to prescribe them. And one of the things that we are trying to do, and many others in the UK are trying to do right now, is to get the IRGC banned as a terrorist organization, prescribed as a terrorist organization, so that it cannot act with impunity in the UK. And if you're thinking, what's he talking about? The IRGC operating in the UK? Well, I have to tell you that there are numerous Iranian Front charities, for example, such as the Maida Vale Mosque, the Islamic Center of England, that's what it's called. There's an Iranian school in Maida Vale. There's also a number of madrasas and other things that are basically run by the IRGC and which are able to funnel funds back and forth and act in that way. And we don't think that's a very sensible thing to be happening in Britain. And we believe that there should be action taken to close these things down as quickly as possible. And the easiest way of doing this would be to prescribe the IRGC and then tracing the links from the IRGC into these organizations and stopping them. So again, that tells you that Iran's tentacles reach out quite far when it comes to the whole terrorist infrastructure that it can do. And lastly, we were discussing, just to bring briefly the internal factor. Yes, Iran is a global threat, but currently it is being rocked by a series of protests. Now, if you recall, these protests started last year when a woman, Mahsa Amini, was arrested for a headscarf violation and was then killed in custody. And that provoked a whole set of protests across Iran, really from top to bottom in terms of social class, men, women, all sorts of people engaging in protesting against the regime's attempt to impose this, this sort of religious law on people. The regime has, of course, responded using force. It's responded to try and crush these, kind of protests. Hasn't managed to do that, interestingly, and they're still alive, but they're not going to topple the regime. But what they tell you is that the regime is not as secure as it thinks it is. If you've had these protests running for months and months and months, and if you've got areas now, Iran, where essentially religious law has been kind of pushed to one side, you'll go to many places now, women are not wearing headscarves, etc., and the regime can't do much about it. You can see that there are some seeds here of transformation within the region. Of course, it's a hideous regime domestically. It uses human rights abuses, summary executions. It persecutes various minorities, sexual minorities. There are all sorts of examples of its corrosive effect, if you like, on the human rights argument. But the positive side of this is that people have made themselves felt. They've been out there, they've spoken up against the regime, they've marched against it, they've taken off their headscarves, etc. And the regime hasn't yet quite worked out how to do it. Now, I don't say for a moment this is going to topple the regime, but it tells us that with the right kind of campaign internally, and with a fair wind behind it, and with a united Iranian opposition, perhaps, which is easier said than done, you could actually end up with the regime being in real trouble and being forced on the back foot. And so ultimately, to end this little section and then to take your questions, I would say the following. It is very difficult for us externally to be able to mitigate Iran's threat. We can try and contain it. We can try and, kind of resist it in some way, in particular on the nuclear front. But the best guarantee of a better future in the Middle East is for the Iranian people themselves to be able to take up, if you like, the cause of freedom within Iran, topple the regime internally, and kind of return Iran to a much more peaceful and helpful course. And if that were to happen, overnight, you would see a transformation of the Middle East position and a far better solution. So, conclude with this, here's a bad, dangerous regime. Things are pretty dire in terms of its intent, both regionally and internationally, but there is a sting in the tail, which is it may not last for long, and we should give the opposition every support we can to help that happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. Jonathan Isaacs, you've got a question. Please unmute yourself. You're on mute, Jonathan. Jonathan? Well,
all right, managed it. Sorry about that. Fascinating talk, Dr. Mendoza. I wonder what you think the effect on Israel will be of the recent agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and in particular, will it affect Israel's ability to use Saudi airspace?
So, well, thank you, Jonathan, for that. And that looks like a spectacular collection of instruments on your wall, Middle Eastern instruments, perhaps even.
Some of them, yes.
Some of them are, in that case. So it's a very good look. You raised an interesting point. I didn't cover it in my talk, because actually I don't believe the Saudi-Iran deal actually means very much. Let's look at what's been agreed. Basically, a couple of weeks ago, out of the blue, the Chinese brokered a deal, a so-called deal between the Saudis and the Iranians. But if you look at what it is, all it is a restoration of diplomatic ties, i.e. they'll open embassies with each other, and there will be some economic trade, perhaps between the two, and some discussion about security. But actually, that's merely the same as Iran and many countries who don't have very good relations with it. Nobody's suggesting for a moment that the Saudis are going to suddenly become Iran's best friends. Saudis know full well what Iran intends for the region, and they certainly know that Iran, wishes the Saudis only ill. So what was really going on with that deal was not aimed at Israel or aimed at, sort of necessarily improving things between Iran and Saudi Arabia. There were two messages being sent. The first was to America, basically. The first message was, look, this was from Saudi Arabia. Look, we're a bit fed up with you. You've not been very kind to us recently. I mean, there's basically a sort of a problem between the US and Saudi because of the whole Khashoggi murder and MBS's role in that. The Americans have not taken kindly to that, but they haven't treated the Saudis as allies, should we just say, since then. So the Saudis have a message basically to the Americans to say, you've neglected us. And the second thing is more than neglect. They basically put two fingers up to the Americans. Oh, I think someone is not on mute, but and they've gone to the Americans, right? Not only have you neglected us, let's play your game for a bit. We'll go to the Chinese, give them some credit, because we know you're at loggerheads with the Chinese as well, and show you want to ignore us. Well, we'll go and play with the Chinese then. Do you like that, America? Come back and play. So really, it's not actually it's not aimed at the Israelis. The Israeli-Saudi relationship is very solid right now. There is constant discussions. There is no doubt that if the Israelis wanted to strike, the Saudis would be fine with it and would allow them to go. This is more about the Saudis, telling the Americans, don't think you can continue to ignore us without us doing something ourselves.
Thank you very much. Has anyone else got a question? Any questions? I've got a question if no one else has. Fine, my question, looking at the medium term over the next 5 years, the best possible solution to what's happening in Iran is regime change.
Yes.
But other than the factors that you've mentioned in your speech, are there other methodologies of regime change being effective? Is there any possibility of outside support? I'm not looking at it right now as of 2023, but over the next, say, 5 years, are there other factors that could come to play that might assist in achieving regime change?
Well, the only thing, look, let's look at the obvious factor. It's the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War. Nobody wants to invade Iran. That's not going to be a solution that's going to be any sense. You can get regime change by invasion. That's not going to happen because nobody's got the stomach for that. Okay, so we take that off the table. Then we're left with internal regime change, either by people rising up essentially and taking over, or the regime collapsing. Now, if you recall what happened with the Shah's regime in the 1970s, what happened to the Shah's regime was that essentially it collapsed. It collapsed because the Shah lost the will to continue, but also economically things were, turning into a disastrous situation. People were out on strike. It just didn't look like there was any way through. If enough pressure was put on Iran economically to really weaken the regime and to really, prevent its ability to keep on, keeping people happy domestically, firstly, you would have obviously the general economic malaise, but secondly, you would have more people upset and willing to come out on the streets, which is why the maximum pressure thing that Donald Trump wanted to do was sensible. The only problem was he couldn't bring anyone else with him, so it didn't work. But if everyone was really applying the sanctions and applying economic pressure to Iran, the regime would essentially be starved of money, be starved of its ability to really deliver economically domestically. That would increase discontent, which would increase the ability of people to come out on the streets to say we need to do better than this. And that would indeed help topple the regime faster than what might happen otherwise. So in answer to your question, yes, we could help from the outside economically by sanctioning Iran quickly and thoroughly, and all of us doing it, not just one country.
Okay, anyone else got a question? Can't see anyone. In which case, can I ask Keith Rowe? Where are you, Keith? Yes, you're here. Keith, our Vice Chairman, to propose a vote of thanks. Keith.
Yes, Dr. Mendoza, thank you very much on behalf of the NJA for being with us this evening and for really bringing us up to speed as to where the world is with regard to this rogue state of Iran. You filled us in on the nuclear state that they're at, the state of the IRGC and its funding of terrorism across the world, the current protests and the weakening of the regime. So I think that we're all far better informed as a result of your talk to us this evening. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us. It's really appreciated. And we'll all watch this with very eager eyes to see what transpires from now on. Thank you.
And we will be welcoming Alan back to the NJA on the 18th of April, because as I told you before, a government minister, Sarah Dines, who is in the Home Office working under Suella Braverman, will be our guest speaker. It's the very first time that the NJA have got a government minister come to speak to us, and we're doing it as an in-person interview, and Alan will be conducting the interview. So we'll be seeing Alan again on the 18th of April. Finally, can I remind everybody, please buy your tickets for our Yom Ha'atzmaut event on the 26th of April. It's happening at the North London Synagogue. It's going to be a very fun evening, big party, and I really hope as many of you as possible come. And on that note, can I just once again thank Alan, thank all of you for giving up your time this evening, and have a nice remainder of the evening. Thank you.